So welcome everyone to the 9th week of our journey through pre-modern Indian narrative literature, believe it or not. This week we'll be continuing our venture into what you could call Sanskrit public culture, and we're going to look at a really fun text called the Vetāla-pañcaviṃśati, or the 25 Tales of the Animated Corpse, the Vetāla. We're going to be looking at a version of these Vetāla tales that was put together by an author named Śivadāsa. We don't actually know a lot about him, so I'm not going to tell you much about him. But the text itself is a fun, amusing collection of 24 folk tales, each that ends with a riddle that the audience has to solve, and that's peppered throughout by very popular verses called subhashitas in Sanskrit. This is a type of literature that gets the term kathā, story literature, and as we look at it, it's going to kind of give us a reflection in some ways about how public culture absorbed Sanskrit language, and not just the elite culture of the courts that was and how this kind of public culture got integrated in some ways with the different vernacular cultures of medieval India, which is going to give rise to regional languages and their traditions, which we're going to start looking at in the coming weeks. So in this podcast, we're going to kind of do two basic things. First, we'll try to get an overview of what some of the key issues and questions are about kathā literature, and specifically about the text we're going to look at, which are the Vetāla tales of this śivadāsa. In the second part of the podcast, we'll walk through the frame story of the Vetāla collection, the story that kind of opens and closes the text, and inside of it, there are 24 other stories that get told by a Vetāla, which is an animated corpse, to a legendary king named Vikrama. And then we're going to walk through one particular story among those 24, story number 9 in the collection, the story of Madanasena, and which is actually take up in more detail in the article that hopefully we can also chat about in class. Let's talk a little bit about what the Vetāla might itself be as well. So first, what is kathā, right? What's Sanskrit story literature, and how might it be different than all these other kinds of literature we've looked at so far? Now remember, we've looked at the epic, the Ramayana, then the courtly epic, or the Mahakāvya of Kalidasa. Then we looked at two different kinds of drama, Nataka, right, Bhavabhuti, and the Bhana of Vararuchi. Now, what makes a kathā collection different from all these different genres? Well, for one, the stories that get told within the kathā, they're fictional. They're clearly fictional, and they're drawn from an oral tradition. So they were probably told very widely, orally, all around India in the first millennium, during that time between 300 to 1300, which we are labeling as the Sanskrit cosmopolis, right? But these tales were also not just told in Sanskrit, or even in one particular community. They can be traced within kind of Hindu traditions and Buddhist traditions, Jain religious traditions. In fact, these tales even ended up spreading orally all outside of India, all across the continents of Europe and Asia in the medieval period. So that's one thing. They're very popular, they're oral, and they migrate, right? They're also anonymous. These tales can't be traced to definitive original authors usually. Another thing about these tales is that instead of taking on kind of technical or very serious features like rasa, right, or various different figures, the metaphors and the similes and all of that, or even themes like dharma or philosophy or those kind of theology, those kind of deep topics. There's a certain kind of fun about these texts, vinoda in Sanskrit. That's what they really want to try to capture. They're often joking in their tone, they're whimsical, they're very tongue-in-cheek in how they describe the various characters like Brahmins and yogis and ministers and merchants and really all sectors of society. The texts feel very young and free-spirited. They kind of remind me sometimes of like high school movies, maybe, right? Or like college movies, American Pie, I don't know, those kind of things. Another thing about the tales is that by the time of the second millennium, right, after 1000 AD, they became anthologized into distinct written collections. So if they were once kind of oral and fluid, they got fixed into a written form around 1000 AD or CE. Now, I've argued in my paper that we're going to read that even though they were fixed in written form, it didn't mean that they stopped being fluid, because the later readers and scribes, the people who were writing down these texts again and again, they could modify the text in certain subtle ways to kind of allow them to have a flexibility. We'll talk about that a bit more maybe in class. Here in the podcast, I want to just point out that when these texts did get anthologized and fixed in a certain way, often the kathā texts were presented within what's called an emboxed frame structure. This means that it's told as stories that are told within a story within a story. It starts off with a character who's talking to another character, and they start telling them a bunch of other stories. So one example that you might know about is the Arabian Nights, right, where Scheherazade tells the Sultan 1001 stories to avoid getting executed. And of course, the Ramayana and Mahabharata in India had some emboxed stories within the stories as well. But in any case, the kathā collections all have this distinct form. There's a frame story, and then all the individual stories are embedded within them as stories within the story. There are three major cycles of these kind of kathā literary genre, and I just maybe wanted to point them out, kind of FYI, really. The oldest tradition is the Panchatantra, which maybe dates as early as 200 CE, maybe even earlier. These are very interesting and lively animal fables that are kind of put together to teach lessons to young, aspiring aristocrats about politics and practical morality, a domain that gets the term Niti Shastra. There's another actually older tradition of animal fables that comes from the Buddhist circles, right, which is called the Jataka tales. These are all about the previous birth of the Buddha. These are maybe a few hundred years older than the Panchatantra. It's unclear. Now there's another cycle of stories called the Bruhat Kathā, or the Great Story, which is a set of adventure and romance tales that center around the life and times of a legendary king named Naravahana Datta. The Bruhat Kathā legends also date to maybe around 200 CE. They were thought to have been originally composed in a language called Paishachi, which means the language of the demons, the Pishachas, and then they were translated into Sanskrit. Did that really happen? Or is that just a kind of tall tale about oral traditions? Who's to say? Right? Finally, there's a major cycle of stories that revolve around a popular legendary king named Vikramaditya, or Vikrama for short, Vikramasena sometimes. Now, he was depicted as a very noble and courageous king, brave and smart, who ruled either at Ujjain in some traditions, or at Pratishtana, which is a kingdom in central India, Paitan for all of you Maharashtrians out there. The Vetāla-pañcaviṃśati, the 25 tales of the animated corpse, the Vetāla, is a set of tales that belongs to this Vikrama cycle of stories, a Vikrama tradition. These Vetāla tales consist of 24 individual riddle-tales, meaning that the tales each are ending with a riddle that you have to solve. And these tales themselves are mostly adventure tales or romances, numbskull stories, kind of about fools and that sort of thing. They're all told by a Vetāla, which is an undead corpse, to our legendary King Vikrama while he's being carried on his back. I'll talk about that story in a bit. There's four major recensions of the Vetāla tales in Sanskrit. Now, we don't need to get into all the details about these. I just wanted to let you know that the one that we're reading in particular was written by Śivadāsa, and it turns out to be the most popular version of this collection. It was written down sometime around the 1200s. It comes after two earlier Sanskrit versions that were composed by poets living in Kashmir in the 11th century, named Kshemendra and Somadeva. The big difference between these two and then our Śivadāsa is that Śivadāsa uses prose, very simple prose sentences instead of complex verses like the others did. And he also peppers his prose with a lot of proverbial verses, subhashitas, as they're called. These are verses that are easy to memorize and recite kind of from heart and contain nuggets of wisdom, proverbs. Right? And they work kind of like how people use proverbs today. You recite them to prove your point. Now let's talk a little bit about what is so special about these Vetāla tales beyond just being fun. And they're meant to be fun. One, like we saw with the Bhanas, if you remember last week, the kathā collections also kind of reach out to the wider public, literary public, maybe, that was outside of the stratified world of the ancient and medieval royal court. The court was an exclusive space, right? Very few people could get into the court. It was for the wealthy, the aristocratic, the powerful, the highly educated pundits of the world, right? But the public, the general, basic educated public, also appreciated a good story. Merchants appreciated good stories. They also wanted some good moral and logical points, and the Vetāla tales kind of combined all of that. They fused riddles, tales, and proverbs together to create something we might call edutainment. Right? That's a phrase that the rapper KRS-One coined in the 80s. The Vetāla tales are fun. They generate a mood that you can call vinoda in Sanskrit, in modern languages as well, in India, vinod. They offer a way to blend folk culture with the elite language of Sanskrit that kind of would have been appealing to the mass public, right? Kind of like how pop culture works today, right? It's designed to appeal to the mainstream, the kind of lowest common denominator in that sense. The Vetāla tales were like comic books in some ways, right? They're written in a way that everyone could get into the story. These were stories that you already had heard orally, and you can have fun with them. You didn't have to be a pundit to appreciate the stories and the literature of the Vetāla. So in this way, the Vetāla tales promoted what you might call an inclusive public culture of Sanskrit rather than an exclusive culture of the court or the temple or the monastery and those kind of stratified spaces. This kind of literature also provided a cultural space where non-elite readers could assert their own intellectual identities, right? Ones that weren't marked by their religious identity, right? So you could be Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, whatever, right? You could be high caste, low caste, Brahmin, non-Brahmin, whatever, and still appreciate these stories. We can expand on that point, maybe also in our discussions if we want to. Now, before we turn to the Vetāla stories themselves and see how the story goes, let's just talk about kind of what the Vetāla might have been, right? This is a fantastical creature, right? But how is it imagined in the text? Here's a depiction of the Vetāla you can see on your screen from a miniature painting from the 18th century. So we get one visual glimpse maybe. The Vetāla is supposed to be a soul, an Atman, that gets trapped within a dead, rotting corpse. Right? And this is because usually of a curse that's placed on the person who's died. Sometimes it's other kinds of special tantric magic spells or powers that are used to inhabit the corpse. Vetālas are magical. The the soul itself that's inhabiting is magical. It can, the corpses can fly, they can appear and disappear at will. They kind of are threatening to humans, but they don't eat humans like Rakshasas do, if you remember them. And the other thing, Vetalas are supposed to have feet that point backwards, just an FYI if you ever encounter one. Another thing you can do if you're a tantric practitioner, a yogi, is you can control Vetalas if you practice the right tantric rituals. Or you can use Vetalas within other tantric rituals in a quest to acquire the 8 great tantric magic powers, the mahasiddhis that tantric yogis were obsessed with in the medieval period. Now, the last lingering question is about what do we call these in English, right? The Vetala. Around 1870, a fellow by the name of Richard Burton created a translation or transcreation, really, of this text that he called the Vikram and the Vampire, right? The Vetala he translated as vampire, and somehow that name is kind of stuck. But it's unfortunate because Vetalas are nothing like vampires. They don't suck blood. They don't seduce women. They aren't allergic to garlic. They don't turn into bats. Right? They don't have to sleep in coffins or anything weird like that. They don't have Slavic accents, right? And wear capes and all of these weird things. People have also tried to translate Vetala as goblin or specter or ghoul, but these also don't really work for the same kind of reasons. Chandra Rajan, the translator of this version that we're reading, she calls the Vetala a genie, and I think that really doesn't work. She gives her reasoning for why she thinks the Vetala is a genie in her introduction. You can have a look at it, tell me what you think, but when I think of genie, I immediately think of that guy from Aladdin, right? And the magic lamp, and the Vetala definitely will not look anything like the genie from Aladdin or grant you 3 wishes or anything like that. Right? Technically, maybe the closest in our mythology is the zombie to the Vetala, but there too there's problems. Vetala doesn't eat human brains, for example. He's not quite as kind of confused and dumb as a zombie, that sort of thing. What I've been doing is either leaving it untranslated as Vetala or translating it as animated corpse, which is kind of the technical definition of what he is. The Vetala isn't evil per se, but he's a trickster figure, someone who challenges the king's normative assumptions about what's right and wrong, about the way the world works, right? About how one should treat religious figures and other figures of authority, and how you assert individual power. So not really a vampire or a genie. Anyway, with that as a kind of introduction to the kathā genre, let's dive right into the Vetāla tales by looking at the opening frame and then walking through one particular story, story number 9, which is about a girl named Madanasena. So here's how the opening frame tale goes. It opens with a mysterious tantric yogi named Kshanti Shila, who comes to visit the noble king Vikramasena, the king of Pratishtana, every single day for 12 years. And each time he comes, the routine of the yogi is to bring one fruit, he hands it to the king, and then takes off. The king thanks him for the gift, but then he'll hand it to his minister, and this keeps going on for 12 years. One day, a monkey grabs the fruit and plays with it, and it falls to the ground, and the fruit breaks in half. Inside, everyone sees that there's a beautiful, priceless jewel. Right? Vikrama then tells his guard, hey, go check the treasury, see what all these other fruit are all about. And they break them all open, and he finds that he's got thousands of jewels in his coffers after 12 years of this yogi coming to visit him. Then when the yogi comes, he asks him, hey, what would you like for me to do in return for all of these jewels? The yogi says, just come meet me in secret, and I'll tell you what I wish you to do. So he does. He goes and meets the yogi in private, and the yogi tells him, look, I'm trying to complete this very difficult tantric ritual to acquire the 8 great mahasiddhis, the supernatural powers. But he needs the king's help to complete it. The king says, absolutely anything you need. The yogi then says, come meet me late at night on the cremation grounds on the 14th day of the dark half of the moon, alone and with your sword in hand. Right? Vikrama promises to do it, and then on that day, Vikrama goes there just as he'd ordered. The yogi then says, look, there's a huge shimshipa tree that's deep in the cemetery. Go there, you'll see a corpse hanging from the tree. Bring it back so that I can use it in my ritual. The king says, okay. He goes to the tree, he sees the corpse, cuts it down, puts it on his shoulder, and heads back to the yogi. But the corpse is actually inhabited by this Vetāla and starts talking to our king. Each time Vikrama answers the Vetāla, it magically returns back to the tree. The king has to go all the way back and cut it down again and bring it back. That's the Vetāla's special magic power. Of course, he can jump right back to the tree when spoken to. The Vetāla then plays a trick on the king. So in order to get him to speak, also to test his wisdom and generally pass this time, the Vetāla starts telling the king different folk tales and then ends each one with a riddle that's based on the facts of the story. If the king knows the answer to the riddle, if he can solve it, then the Vetāla says you have to tell it, otherwise I curse you that your head will shatter into 1,000 pieces. So then the king, as soon as he solves each riddle, he's smart and he solves each one, right? The Vetāla jumps right back to the tree and they have to start all over again. So this is the frame, and it goes on 24 different times until finally the Vetāla gets to a tale with a riddle that has no answer. And here's how it goes. So there's a king in South India who's attacked and killed, but his wife, the queen, and their daughter, the princess, they escape into the forest unharmed. Right? Meanwhile, there's another king and his son, the prince. They're out hunting in the woods, and they stumble onto 2 sets of women's footprints. One of them is big, one of them is small. The king says, look, son, I'll marry the woman with the bigger feet. You can marry the one with the smaller feet. Right? But then when they actually hunt down the women, they meet the queen and the princess. It turns out that the princess has the bigger feet and the queen has the smaller feet. But still, a promise is a promise, right? And so the king has to marry the princess. The prince has to marry the queen. They both, in time, each have kids. Then the Vetāla asks his riddle. What's the family relationship between the 2 kids, right, of the princess and the queen? Right? Vikrama finds no way to answer the riddle. He can't solve this tangled relationships, and so he just stays silent. Right? And the Vetāla doesn't go back to the tree, and so then we get to the closing frame of the whole collection. Now, after all of these tales, the Vetāla gets impressed with the king's wisdom and smarts, basically. Right? And he says, look, I want to help you out, Vikramji. He says the yogi isn't actually being honest with you. What he wants to do is to decapitate me, the Vetāla, but also you, the king, and he needs to stand on both of our heads while praying to the goddess in order to finally acquire these magic powers that he's looking for. The Vetāla says, look, the yogi is going to do this. He's going to ask you to bow down to the goddess as part of his ritual, and then when you're prostrated down, he's going to chop your head off with your own sword. Then this is how it ends. Vikrama then, when the yogi asks him to do this, Vikrama says to the yogi, look, I'm an emperor, and I've never had to bow down to anyone. So I don't actually know how to bow down, right? Maybe you could show me. And so then the yogi does, and at the very moment that the yogi bows down to the goddess to show him how to do it, Vikrama chops off the fake yogi's head. The Vetāla then becomes the loyal servant of Vikramaditya, Vikramasena, and then Vikrama goes back and rules his kingdom happily ever after, right? The end. Interesting, isn't it? That's how the frame story goes. Now within it, there's all kinds of fascinating short tales of adventure, romance, amusements, all kinds of fun. I thought we could go through one which was very popular in medieval times and which in fact has spread all over the world, all the way west through Arab and European cultures, all the way to Ireland, east through Central Asia, Mongolia, Tibet, China. This is story number 9 in the collection, the story of Madanasena and the Thief. And it goes kind of like this. So there's a merchant's son named Dharmadatta who sees a beautiful girl named Madanasena playing with her friends in a park during the spring festival. he lusts after her and accosts Madanasena, this beautiful girl, and declares, "I'm going to die if you do not marry me." But she turns him down. She says, "Hey, look, I'm already engaged to someone else." Dharmadatta then threatens to force himself upon her if she doesn't comply. Basically, he's going to rape her. Right? To stop him, Madanasena then promises, "Look, I'll come to you after my wedding, but before actually consummating my marriage, if that's okay." Dharmadatta says that's okay, and he lets her go. She then gets married, right? And then her husband tries to sleep with her on their wedding night. She says, "Hey, look, I made this promise to this guy." So the husband actually then lets her go, and she gets all dressed up, puts on her jewelry, goes out in the night, right? She's walking over to the merchant's house, but a thief catches her. And he's about to take all her jewels and who knows what else, but then he lets her go when she tells her story to him, because he says he doesn't want to interfere in your love affair. He's kind of impressed. Right? When she finally reaches the man who accosted her, he basically dumps her, because he now treats her as if she's used goods. He's not interested in her anymore now that she's married. So then she starts to go back home to her husband, but again runs into the thief on the road. She tells the thief what happened to her this time, and again he lets her go. He's kind of amazed of what this guy did. And so then when she gets back home, her husband accepts her with a warm embrace. The Vetāla then asks the king, "Who's the most noble among these three? The husband, the lover, or the thief?" Right? The king answers that it's not the husband or the lover, but it's actually the thief. The husband had let her go because he thought that she was in love with this other guy. Right? The would-be lover had let her go because he was afraid of being punished, but the thief didn't do it out of any self-oriented reasons. He only did it out of goodness. So hearing the correct answer, the Vetāla immediately disappears from Vikrama's shoulder, again dangles from the tree deep in the cremation grounds. Vikrama now has to trudge all the way back to the tree, foist the corpse back on his shoulder, and carry it back to the tantric yogi. So as he's doing that, let's stop it here, and we'll see you next time.